For this video, I want to continue the cap series that I was doing before. In the last video, I kind of went over my ideas and thoughts about the cap K overall and why I think it's the most popular argument that you'll see in policy debate, and why I think that these videos can be helpful for anybody, whether you're going for the cap K or answering it. I've always said that being able to being familiar with arguments that you're trying to answer is always helpful, and then the more familiar that you get with the arguments you're trying to answer, the better you'll get at answering them. And I also think that the cap K is an argument that teaches you a lot of things about the fundamentals of debate that you can apply to other arguments you're making in debate from whatever type of perspective or angle. And so I think tuning into this video can be really helpful regardless. In the last video, I kind of broke my general tips down for being able to go for the cap K against policy teams specifically, and then I'll kind of go into the K teams afterwards. I've basically talked about why the way in which we are able to cite and use different types of history in order to create a lot of the top level and the framework arguments and link arguments you're making are really important. And so I kind of want to continue being able to apply some of the stuff that I talked about in that video to stuff that I'll be talking about this video when I start breaking down the relationship that I think a cap K versus a policy team would respond to arguments like the permutation, how it goes about things like impact comparison, and the way that it should debate about the alternative. I think being able to do all these things is really important to being able to execute the strategy holistically, because I think the cap K really shows the ways in which different parts of the critique play into each other, and the way that they're all kind of useful for feeding into each other and to making better arguments. And so I think generally being able to understand how these different pieces interact can be really integral to making a strategy that is useful against a host of variety of policy asks. I talked about it a bit in the last video, but I do want to restate here that I think that this argument is heavily underutilized against the amount of teams that it can be read against. And I think the reason why I was saying that so much in the last video is partially because I think that there is a lack of confidence in the ability to apply it broadly and understand how the different moving parts can make the strategy a lot more broad-based. And so hopefully this video will kind of help you with a lot of that. So to kind of continue to where we stopped with the last video, I want to first start talking about the permutation. I think that this is where some cap teams can struggle against AVs that specifically try to be anti-capital, or AVs that try to reduce the ability for the state to control certain types of resources. I think that this basically doesn't allow us to think about the types of diversity that I think you can make when you're able to cite the way in which capitalism works. I think that a lot of teams get see that an argument is saying that we should reduce state power and automatically want to run away or try to win, that there's some type of circumvention or other argument that may not be as solid. But I think that there are a lot of other creative ways for you to be able to answer this argument. The first, I think, is that you need to be really specific about the way that the alternative interacts with the affirmative. I think that the thing that you can do to get yourself out of being able to get into these permutation debates is first to speak to the examples and build real big differentials between the way in which the AF organizes politics and the way that the criticism does. Doing that with having a specific understanding of the alternative and a specific articulation of the alternative can be really integral in order to building disads against the permutation that are built into the example, and thus can make it a lot harder for the other team to be able to win net benefits because they don't really have comparable examples that are as specific as yours. And so I think that already the persuasiveness of the permutation starts to move behind when you're able to start with just starting to win a really specific explanation of how the alternative functions and the types of barriers that the AF puts in front of the alternative's function. I think that intuitive arguments about permutation and order are good here, because I think that most permutations that come from an AF side require the alt to come first and to be this corrective that happens after the AF happens. And I think that being able to refocus the conversation on the permutation and being able to win arguments about why putting the alternative in first in the context of a permutation means that you're actually voting negative in front of affirmative can be really interesting distinctions that you're able to bring out about the way in which the alternative plays in the context of the AF. I think that a lot of teams that are reading this argument or that are trying to answer this argument become so over-focused on the ability to win that the alternative could exist in the world of the AF that they don't really focus on the order question of the permutation, which I think is a really good place for you to generate a lot of offense. The other argument that I would say is that I think against affirmatives that try to move towards a permutation route or try to move towards the state being more anti-capital or redistributing resources in a certain way, or removing its management of resources in a certain way, I think that making arguments that still consider things like the fill-in from the private sector and the way in which the private sector interacts with these types of government policies over resource management, I think can be really helpful in order to build permutation arguments that show why the app still presents a barrier as like a style of policy making, instead of one that can just be resolved by being able to have like a plain text that may or may not move in the right direction. This is kind of what I was saying about being able to like build framing arguments earlier on in the video first that are favorable for you to win, different articulations of the alternative that don't require you to win that the alternative is necessary a refusal of the affirmative, but rather that from the heuristic that we take up for how we decide debates that the affirmative is moving in the wrong direction. I think that this is all kind of magnified by the type of impact comparison that you do, and I think that like impact comparison is where a lot of cat teams sink or swim, because I think it can either be a really huge weapon or end up being like pretty useless and actually more of a burden because of the responsibility that it places on the alternative. I think it's usually better to hold the line on the material impacts of capitalism if you can win that you have an alternative that scales up, but if you don't, then it's best to pair your argument with framing arguments that you make earlier on, framing arguments that are about what capitalism justifies as an unethical, framing arguments about like what capitalism justifies and why that's unethical can be an easy out to having to not hold the responsibility of having to weigh the arguments to getting the full weight of the arguments that you're making without having to carry the full weight of the material kind of like implications of those things, which means that your alternatives can have a lot more diversity in terms of the ways in which you propose them. Maybe they're not always arguments about praxis, maybe they're arguments about resource strategies that just say that the way in which the app represents the world is one that affirms capitalism and one that we should just reject on face value as a resource strategy. But I think there definitely is value to being able to win the really material impacts of capitalism because of how those implications are very easily shown in various impacts that in various examples that you can draw through like a very diverse literature base. And I think being able to like do basic impact calculus at the level of like magnitude and probability can really help you make a persuasive argument here, as long as you have an alternative to resolve it. So speaking of the alternatives, I think that the alternative debate is really just a debate about examples. I think you should always think about the direction of the alternative in relationship to the framing arguments you make early on and the way that you're able to match them up with impact claims. Being able to build a coherent story there is critical for the execution of the CapK against policy teams, because being able to match these arguments in a way where there's no questions asked in how they resolve and interact with each other can really make your strategy come together holistically and allow the judge to kind of take themselves to a logic where they understand exactly why they're voting negative and there's a clear picture of what that vision of the world looks like. I think doing this type of explanatory and specific work earlier on in places like the cross-X and in places like the 2NC and 1NC cross-X are really important, because it allows you to take like time to really be able to not force yourself to like have a burden to re-explain the will in the 2NR and to not carry on a bunch of baggage into the 2NR. Be able to kind of have these explanations and examples early on the debate and kind of focusing on 1, 2, or 3 examples that you can like really make a lot of time to go in depth on. I think it's a lot better than just trying to scatter yourself all over the place and just win offense in a bunch of different places, because I think that the CapK kind of rewards you for having a strategy that comes all together. Hopefully this portion of the CapK video and the lecture series I'm doing is helpful, and you'll tune into the next series of videos I'm doing, and hopefully you'll keep watching for more.